He hit her hard enough that the rack behind her rang like a struck bell. You put your hands on that rifle again, and I will end your career on this floor. A three-star general's voice filling the whole bay. You are a fraud. You are a disgrace. Guards, I want her in a cell. Nobody moved. Every soldier in that room waited for the girl to break, to cry, to beg. Instead, she pushed herself off the steel, straightened her uniform, looked Lieutenant General Malcolm Rhodes dead in the eyes, and said four quiet words that stopped a man with 34 years of war behind him cold. Before we go further, if you love stories about quiet people who get underestimated and then prove the whole room wrong, take a second to subscribe, stay with this story all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I would genuinely love to see how far this one travels. Now let's begin. I signed for it, sir. That was all. Four words spoken without heat, without fear, without so much as a tremor at the back of them. She did not raise her voice to match his. She did not lower her eyes the way soldiers do when they want a superior's anger to pass over them like weather. She simply said the thing that was true and then stood there and let it be true in front of everybody. Malcolm Rhodes had commanded men in places that never appeared on any map. He had stood in rooms where a single sentence decided whether people got to keep breathing. He had watched full colonels go gray in the face when he raised his voice, and he had come to understand over 3 decades that the sound of his own anger was one of the more reliable instruments he owned. It had just failed him completely, and he did not know what to do with that. Say it again, Sergeant. He said it quietly. That was worse than the shouting, and every soldier in Bay 3 understood immediately that it was worse. I signed for it, sir. I'm cleared for this weapon. If the general wants to verify that, I'd want to verify it too. He took 2 slow steps toward her. Behind him, a private first class near the ammunition locker had frozen with a cleaning rod still in his hand, and he had been frozen that way long enough that his arm had started to shake. Sergeant Vane at the workbench was staring at a spot on the floor with the concentration of a man trying to fall through it. And there was this young woman, small and unremarkable, and standing beside a Barrett M107, one of the most restricted pieces of hardware on the entire depot, with roughly the posture of a person waiting for a bus. Rhodes asked her name. Staff Sergeant Adeline Rourke, sir. He asked how long she had been at Blackfoot Ridge. 2 weeks, sir. 2 weeks. He let the number sit in the cold air between them. 14 days on his installation, and she had decided all by herself that she was cleared to handle a weapon. Half his senior officers could not sign out without 3 separate approvals and a phone call. Yes, sir, that's correct. And that was the thing that unbalanced him a second time. She was not arguing. She was not maneuvering. She was not doing any of the small, frantic things a person does when they are trying to make a lie hold its shape. She answered him the way you answer somebody who has asked what day it is. He turned his head slightly, not enough to take his eyes off her. Sergeant Vane, did you watch this soldier remove that rifle from the rack? Vane's throat moved. He said she had paperwork. He said she had come to the arms room window that morning with a clearance form, and the old man behind the counter had pulled the file, checked the form, checked her ID, and signed the weapon out to her himself. He said it looked real, sir. He said it looked completely real. It looked real. Rhodes turned toward him fully now. Do you know what the penalty is for allowing unauthorized access to a restricted weapon, Sergeant? Vane knew. Vane knew exactly. Vane opened his mouth and absolutely nothing came out of it. And it was Rourke who answered for him. She did it without hesitating and without any visible calculation. And Rhodes would think about that later, the speed of it, the reflex of it. A soldier 14 days onto a base she did not know, standing in front of a general who had just put her into a steel rack, and her first instinct was to reach out and pull somebody else out of the fire. Because I gave him valid documentation, sir. Sergeant Vane followed procedure exactly. The arms room followed procedure exactly. If there's a problem with my access, the problem is in my file, not in anybody's judgment on this floor. I'd ask the general to remember that when this gets sorted out. Rhodes stared at her. 34 years had taught him to read soldiers the way some men read a sky. He knew the liars by the drift of their eyes and the small unnecessary details they volunteered. He knew the terrified ones by the shine on the upper lip and the way they agreed too fast. He knew the frauds. He had met a great many frauds, and he knew that a fraud always over-explains because a fraud is building something in the air, and building takes words. Adeline Roark had used 41 words total since he walked into the room, and 19 of them had been spent defending a sergeant she had known for 2 weeks. She was not any of the things he had walked in here certain she was, and that frightened him considerably more than a lie would have. Put the rifle down. She did not put it down. Not immediately. She dropped the magazine, locked the bolt to the rear, looked into the chamber. Put a finger in the chamber, then turned the weapon and held it out to him, with the action open exactly as regulation demanded, in one smooth, uninterrupted motion, with the specific, unhurried boredom of a person who had done it 10,000 times in the dark. Rhodes looked at the open chamber, then he looked at her hands. They were not steady the way a nervous soldier's hands are steady when they are being held steady on purpose. They were steady the way a table is steady. Somewhere years back, those hands had simply stopped shaking, and whatever had done that to them had not been kind. Set it on the bench, then come with me. The walk from Bay 3 to the headquarters building was 140 yards of open ground, and Malcolm Rhodes did not say a single word for any of it. That was deliberate. It was one of the oldest tools he owned, and it had never once failed him. You give a person enough silence, and their own imagination does the interrogating for you. Junior officers had confessed to him in that silence. A battalion commander had once started apologizing to him halfway across a motor pool for something Rhodes had not even known about yet. It did not touch Adeline Roark. She walked beside him with her chin level and her eyes forward. She matched his stride without seeming to try. She did not glance at him to check his mood. She did not fill the silence with a preemptive explanation, which is what 95% of human beings do inside of 40 seconds. She simply walked, and she was still walking that way when they got to the top of the stairs, and it occurred to Rhodes somewhere around the third-floor landing that the silence was not costing her anything at all, and that he had spent 140 yards interrogating himself. In his office, he'd told her to stand at ease. She stood at ease. He sat down and pulled the personnel system up on his monitor, and she waited without a word, hands loose at her sides, and did not look at his walls or his photographs or his ribbons, which was another thing nobody did. I'm going to look at your file, he said, and when I do, I'm going to find that somebody made an extremely expensive mistake with your paperwork somewhere along the line, and then you and I are going to have a very different conversation. Are we clear? Perfectly, sir. He typed her name. He entered his own command credentials that opened nearly every door the United States Army had, and the screen stopped him. He leaned toward it because he was certain he had misread it. He had not. The file existed. That was the strange part. It was not missing, and it was not empty. It was there, and almost all of it was black. Name, rank, date of grade, blood type. Those were visible sitting at the top, like the first 4 sentences of a book with every other page torn out. And then line after line, training history classified, unit assignments classified, deployment record classified, awards and decorations redacted, see restricted addendum, prior commanding officers access denied at your clearance level, access denied at his clearance level. Rhodes sat back very slowly in his chair. On had a clearance that most human beings on this planet would never come within 100 miles of. He had read documents that could have started wars and had prevented at least 2. And his own system on his own installation was politely informing a lieutenant general of the United States Army that he was not cleared to know where a 24-year-old staff sergeant had spent the last 5 years of her life. Sergeant Roark. His voice had changed, and he heard it change. The anger was gone out of it, and something more careful had moved into the space. Who is your reporting to, officer? I'm not permitted to say, sir. You are standing in my office on my installation. I am a general officer, and I am giving you a lawful order to tell me who your reporting officer is. With respect, General, my orders came with specific restrictions attached. I can't disclose my reporting chain to anyone below a certain access level. If the general's clearance is sufficient, the system will show him. If the system won't show the general, then I'm not permitted to override the system by opening my mouth, sir. He looked at her for a long moment. Here was the part he would turn over in his hands for months afterward, the part that got under his skin and stayed there. She did not enjoy it. Not one bit of it. A lesser person would have enjoyed that sentence. A lesser person would have savored the shape of it, standing in a general's office with a locked door in their hands. There was no triumph anywhere in her face. If anything, there was something almost apologetic in her eyes, as though she genuinely wished she could hand him what he was asking for and simply was not allowed to. He rubbed a hand across his jaw, and that was when he noticed it. It was small, and it was dark, and it sat on her uniform in a place where nothing was supposed to sit, and he had walked past it in the bay and walked past it again for 140 yards because it was matte black on a matte background, and the human eye slides right off things like that. It was not a marksmanship badge. It was not a combat badge. It was not from any regulation he had ever read in 34 years, and he had read all of them. It was a plain black tab, roughly the size of a dog tag, and engraved into it in small, precise numerals was a single figure. 3,200. What is that? She did not answer immediately. On your chest, Sergeant. That marking, I don't recognize it. And for the first time in the entire encounter, something moved across Adeline Rourke's face. It was there and gone in less than a second, and it was not fear, and it was not pride, and it was not the flush of a person about to be caught in something. It was closer to grief. It was the look of somebody being asked about a person they buried. It's a unit marking, sir. What does the number mean? She hesitated. It was the first hesitation she had produced all morning. Sergeant, what does 3,200 mean? Meters, sir. The word landed in that office and did not move. Rhodes sat very still. He knew better than almost anyone still walking around in a uniform exactly what that number meant when you attached it to a soldier and a 50 caliber rifle. He had spent enough of his career around long-range shooters to understand the arithmetic, and the arithmetic was brutal, and it did not care about anybody's feelings. He knew that a well-trained military marksman operates effectively out to 800 meters, and that 800 meters is already a distance most civilians cannot imagine. He knew that the genuinely exceptional ones, the men who spend an entire career behind glass, who dream in mil dots, reach past 1,000, past 1,200 on a good day, with a good spotter in clean air. With luck, they will never admit to needing. He knew that the longest confirmed combat shots in the recorded history of human beings, the ones that get studied in schools and talked about in the low reverent voices men use for miracles, live somewhere in the range of 2,000 to 3,000 meters. He knew you could count the people who had ever done it on your fingers and have fingers left over. And here was a 24-year-old woman 14 days onto his depot, standing in his office in a uniform he had just thrown against a rack, wearing a tab that claimed 3,200. That's not possible. It came out before he could stop it, and he heard how it sounded, not like a general issuing a judgment, like a man arguing with a number. The general is free to believe that, sir. Do you understand what you're telling me? Do you understand how few human beings could even attempt a shot at that distance? You're describing something past nearly every confirmed record that has ever been logged. And you want me to accept that you did it at your age and that there is no record of it anywhere I am cleared to look. I don't need the general to believe anything. Her voice did not rise. The general asked me what the number meant. I answered him honestly. What the general does with that answer isn't my decision, sir. 2 floors below and 1 building over, a routine query notification generated by a lieutenant general's credentials left Blackfoot Ridge Army Depot on an automated line. The way 10,000 such notifications leave military installations every day and get read by absolutely nobody. 600 miles away, an account with no name attached to it opened that notification. It stayed open for 4 seconds. Then it closed and nothing else happened, and no one at Blackfoot Ridge had any way of knowing that anything had happened at all. He should have thrown her out. That was the sensible move, and every part of his training told him so. The sensible move was to flag the file call and investigators, hand the whole tangled mess to somebody whose actual job was tangled messes, and go back to running a depot. Any reasonable general would have done exactly that, and the Malcolm Rhodes who had walked into Bay 3 90 minutes ago, fully intending to end a young soldier's career, would not have hesitated for a heartbeat. He did not do it, because in 34 years, Malcolm Rhodes had built his entire reputation on one thing. Not his temper had cost him more than it had ever earned him. Not his rank, on his ability to know a real soldier when one was standing in front of him. And every instinct he owned, every hard-bought piece of judgment he had paid for across 3 decades was screaming at him that the young woman in front of him was the genuine article, and that if he sealed this and handed it off and walked away, he would spend whatever years he had left wondering. Sit down. Sir, that wasn't a request, Sergeant. Sit down. She sat. He leaned forward and folded his hands on the desk, and he looked at her the way he had not looked at anybody in a very long time. Not as a commander looking down at a subordinate, as one human being trying very hard to understand another one. I'm going to be honest with you, Rourke, because you've been honest with me from the second I put you into that rack, and it would have cost you nothing to lie. 90 minutes ago, I was going to have your stripes. I thought you were a fraud. I have seen 100 frauds in this uniform, and I know precisely what they look like, and every single one of them came apart the moment I raised my voice. He paused. You didn't come apart. That tells me something. But your file tells me nothing, and I do not like being told nothing on my own installation. So I'm going to ask you one question, and I want you to think very carefully about your answer. Are you what that tab says you are? Adeline Rourke looked at him for a long moment. Yes, sir, I am. Then prove it. The words were out of his mouth before he had entirely finished deciding to say them. But once they were out, he did not reach for them. You heard me, Sergeant. Your file won't tell me the truth. Your reporting chain won't tell me the truth, so I'm going to do the only thing left that I actually know how to do. I'm going to put you behind a rifle, and I'm going to give you a target, and I'm going to watch it happen with my own two eyes. And if you are what you say you are, I'll find that out. And if that tab is a lie, I will find that out, and you will answer for every second of it. Do you accept that, Shem? And for the first time all morning, something touched the corner of Adeline Rourke's mouth. It was not a smile exactly. It was quieter than a smile and considerably sadder. And if Rhodes had been asked to name it, he would have said it looked almost like relief. Yes, sir, I accept that. The news moved through Blackfoot Ridge the way a grass fire moves through August. By that afternoon, every soldier on the depot knew that some mystery sergeant, some kid who had appeared out of nowhere 2 weeks ago, who ate alone, who didn't talk, who nobody could place, had talked back to a 3-star general and somehow walked out of it with an official long-range evaluation instead of a court-martial. The opinions came fast and they came loud, and most of them were cruel. In the NCO club that evening, Master Sergeant Wade Pruitt set down his coffee hard enough that it slopped and laughed out loud when he heard the number. 3,200 meters, Pruitt said. Did they hear that 3,200? That was farther than anything he had seen in 28 years. That was farther than the best shooters in this entire country could reach on the best day of their lives with God himself holding the wind. And they wanted him to believe that some 24-year-old girl nobody had ever heard of who had been on this depot for 14 days could do it on demand. Somebody said maybe she had connections. Oh, she's got connections, Pruitt said. That's exactly what she's got. Somebody upstairs is looking out for that girl, and now she strolls in here like she owns the place. And the old man is going to burn a whole range day proving what every one of us already knows. There was laughter around that table. There was head shaking. There was the specific, comfortable cruelty of experienced men who have decided before seeing a single thing with their own eyes that a young woman cannot possibly be what she says she is. What none of them said out loud, what one or two of them knew, and had the decency not to bring up, was that Wade Pruitt's son had washed out of sniper school 9 weeks earlier. 2 months of the kid on the phone every Sunday. 2 months of a father telling his boy that the standard was the standard and that nobody got carried through that course. And now this. That was the thing about the cruelty in that room. It never came from nowhere. It always came from somewhere, and the somewhere was almost always a wound. Not everybody laughed. At the far end of the club, alone with a cup of coffee, going cold in front of him, and no intention of drinking it, sat Captain Ruben Vasquez. Vasquez ran the long-range facility out at Coyote Flats, where the evaluation would happen. He was 38, and he had spent 12 of those years standing behind the finest marksmen this Army produced. He had trained some of them. He had watched 2 of them break down crying at the 2,000-meter line because the wind had taken something away from them that they had earned. He did not laugh because Ruben Vasquez had heard something that afternoon that nobody else in that room had heard. The evaluation paperwork had crossed his desk at 1100 hours, and he had made a routine call to a friend at another command to sort out range logistics. Nothing more than that. A schedule call. And when he said the name Rourke, the man on the other end of the line had gone completely silent. Say that name again, the voice had said. Rourke, Adeline Rourke, Staff Sergeant, running a long-range eval for her out here at the end of the week. There had been a silence on that line long enough that Vasquez had checked the screen to see if the call had dropped. Then his friend had said, "Ruben, do yourself a favor. Whatever you think you know about long-range shooting, 12 years of it, all of it, leave it at the gate before you watch that woman shoot. And do not under any circumstances embarrass yourself by betting against her." Who is she? I can't tell you that. I'm not cleared to tell you that, and neither are you. But I'm telling you as a friend, that girl is not what she looks like. Nobody who ends up wearing that tab is what they look like. And then the line had gone dead, and it had stayed dead, and when Vasquez called back an hour later, it rang out. So Captain Ruben Vasquez sat in the corner of the NCO club and listened to a table of men who had never spoken a word to Adeline Rourke explain with total confidence exactly how she was going to fail. And he said nothing at all. He just sat there thinking about the length of that silence on the phone and the way his friend's voice had dropped an entire register the moment he heard her name. She heard the laughter. That was the part nobody in the NCO club considered because nobody in the NCO club had thought about her as a person who existed when they were not looking at her. But the club shared a wall with the corridor she used to get back to transient billeting, and she walked that corridor at the exact moment Wade Pruitt was explaining to four men how a 24-year-old girl was about to miss a piece of steel by a country mile. She did not slow down. She did not speed up either. She had learned a long time ago in a place she was not permitted to name that other people's certainty about you is not information. It is weather. It happens whether or not you participate in it, and the only real mistake is to stand out in it and argue with the sky. But she was tired that night in a way she had not been in a while, and she noticed that she was tired, and that bothered her more than the laughing did. Back in the transient barracks, she sat on the edge of her bunk and did the thing her hands did when the rest of her needed to be quiet. She field-stripped a rifle, not the Barrett. She would not touch the Barrett again until the evaluation, and she knew it. Just an ordinary weapon out of the ordinary pool, a rifle she would never fire clean by a woman who had cleaned it that morning and would clean it again tomorrow. That was what people never understood about her. They saw the number and they thought it meant gift, talent, something she had been handed at birth and carried around like a lottery ticket. It was the opposite of that. The number meant repetition. The number meant 10,000 mornings of doing an ordinary thing perfectly when there was nobody in the room to see it and no reward for doing it right. The number meant that on the single worst day of her life, when everything inside her chest had been screaming, her hands had already been trained so far past the point of thought that they had simply gone ahead and done their job without her. That was not a gift you get to enjoy. She was 5 minutes into the bolt carrier when her phone rang. She looked at it. Unknown number. No area code she recognized, which by itself meant something, because unknown numbers still carry area codes. A number with no origin at all is a number that has been built. It rang once, it rang twice, it stopped. Adeline Rourke did not move. The bolt carrier was still in her left hand, and a patch was still in her right, and she sat exactly like that with the phone face up beside her on the blanket and the screen going dark, and she did not put either of them down for a very long time. She had spent 2 weeks at Blackfoot Ridge deliberately being nobody. She had signed for a rifle from a gray-haired old warrant officer behind the arms room window who had looked at her ID a half-second longer than necessary and then handed it back without a word. She had eaten alone. She had volunteered for nothing. She had built her small, careful, invisible life exactly the way she had been building it in one place after another for 5 years. And she had been perfectly willing to keep building it forever. And then a general had put her into a steel rack and she had told him the truth, and now 100 people knew a number that 6 people on Earth were supposed to know. Somewhere out there a light had come on over her name. She had not heard that ring in 5 years. It had only ever meant one thing. She did not sleep and she did not pretend to. At some point around 2 in the morning, she reassembled the rifle she would never fire, wiped down the bench, and sat with her back against the wall, and her eyes open, and she went through the thing she always went through when the ring came, the list of everyone who could still reach her and what it would mean if each of them did. The list was short. That was the whole design of her life. It had been built short on purpose by a man in a gray suit 5 years ago while she was still shaking. Somebody knocked on the door frame at 20 past 5. Captain Ruben Vasquez was standing there out of uniform with 2 paper cups of coffee, and he looked like a man who had also not slept, which she noticed and filed away. Sergeant Rourke, mind if I sit down for a minute? It's the captain's depot, sir. The captain can sit wherever he likes. That's a very polite way of not answering. He came in anyway and set one of the cups down beside her and lowered himself onto the empty bunk across from hers, and for a moment he didn't say anything, which she also noticed. Most officers filled silence the way water fills a low spot. I'm running your evaluation, he said finally. Figured we should talk before we're both standing out at Coyote Flats with half the depot watching. Yes, sir. You know what they're saying about you. It wasn't a question, so she didn't answer it like one. I'm aware, sir, and it doesn't bother you. She set the coffee down without drinking any of it. She looked at him with those flat gray eyes that seemed to belong to somebody about 20 years older than the rest of her. Captain Vasquez, may I be honest with you? I wish you would. What people decide about me before they've watched me shoot isn't information. It's noise. And I stopped listening to noise a long time ago in a place where listening to noise got people killed. She said it plainly without any weight on it, which somehow made it land harder. So no, sir, it doesn't bother me. I've been doubted by better men than the ones in that club. I'm still here. She paused and something in her face shifted slightly. That isn't arrogance. I want the captain to understand that. It's just the truth, and I'm tired enough that I've stopped decorating the truth to make it easier to hear. Vasquez turned the cup in his hands. 12 years around shooters, he said. You know what I've noticed about the really good ones? They want you to know. They can't help it. They drop it into conversations sideways. They tell you the story about the one nobody believes, because being good is the biggest thing in their entire world, and they need it to be the biggest thing in yours too. He looked up. You haven't done any of that, not once. Every time you've told me you're good, it's because I asked you point blank. And every single time you say it, you look like you'd rather be talking about literally anything else. That's because I would, sir. Why? She was quiet for a beat too long, and when she answered, her voice had dropped. Because the shots I'm proud of aren't the ones I'm allowed to talk about. And the number on this tab isn't something I won, Captain. There was no trophy. There was no ceremony. I want the captain to be very clear about that before he watches me shoot, because I think he's a good enough officer that he deserves to know what he's actually looking at. Her thumb moved once across the edge of the coffee cup. That number came from the worst day of my life, and every single time I put my eye behind a scope, I have to walk back into that day to do it. Every time. That's the price of admission, and it does not go down. Vasquez didn't say anything for a while. Who were you shooting for, he asked. That day, she picked the cleaning rod back up. Her hands were steady. Her voice when it came was not quite. People who were counting on me to be perfect, she said. That's all I can say, sir. People who were counting on me and who didn't have anybody else. He stood up slowly and looked down at a young sergeant cleaning a rifle. She wasn't going to use, and he understood all at once, and completely why his friend on the phone had gone silent. I'm going to tell you one thing, Rourke, and then I'll leave you alone. Day after tomorrow, there are going to be a lot of men on that line hoping you fail. Some because they can't stand that you might be better than they are. Some because you're new and young, and you didn't ask anybody's permission to be extraordinary. He stopped at the door. I'm not one of them. Whatever happens out there, at least one person watching wants you to hit that plate, not to prove anything to the general, just because I think you've earned the right to be believed. She looked up, and for about a second and a half, the armor slipped, and he saw exactly how tired she was underneath it. Thank you, sir, she said. The captain has no idea how rare it is for someone to say that to me. Sayo. The complaint hit Rhodes's desk at Bureau 900. It was formal. It was written in the stiff, careful language of a man who had spent 28 years learning exactly how far he could push and no farther, and it was signed by Master Sergeant Wade Pruitt. Rhodes read it twice. It requested respectfully that the evaluation be conducted under standard qualification conditions, with standard spotter support and standard ranging procedures in the interest of the integrity of the record. It never once used the word fraud. It didn't have to. Every sentence in it was built around the word. Rhodes had Pruitt in his office inside of 20 minutes. Master Sergeant, you want to say to my face what you wrote in this. Pruitt stood at attention and did not soften a single word of it. He said that in 28 years he had never seen a shot past 2,000 meters confirmed by anybody anywhere, and that he had personally spotted for men who would be remembered by name for 100 years. He said that if this evaluation went forward, loose one shot, no witnesses trained to catch a lie, then the number was going to go into a record. And once a number goes into a record, it stops being a claim and starts being a fact. And it becomes something other soldiers get measured against forever. And then he said the part that gave him away. Sir, I've got people out there right now killing themselves to make a standard, grinding, failing, and coming back. And if a soldier can walk onto this depot with a black tab and a sealed file and just be handed the biggest number in the history of the craft, because a general got curious, then what exactly am I supposed to tell the ones who did it the hard way and still didn't make it? Rhodes looked at him for a long moment. He had heard about the boy. Somebody had mentioned it in passing weeks ago and he had forgotten it, and now it came back and sat down in the middle of the room. You know what I hear in that, Master Sergeant? Sir. I hear a father. Pruitt's jaw tightened. I'm not going to embarrass you about it, and I'm not going to hold it against you because it's the most human thing anybody said in this building in a month. But I want you to carry it out that door with you, and I want you to be honest with yourself about how much of that complaint is about the integrity of the record and how much of it is about a young man who didn't get what he wanted. Pruitt didn't answer. Request denied, Rhodes said, but not the way you think. He turned the complaint around on the desk. You want it tighter? Fine. We'll make it tighter than anything you've ever stood behind. Cold bore, no fouling shot, no warm-up, no ranging round, no adjustment. One round. He tapped the paper once. And then when that's done, we move the wind. Second plate, same distance, different window after the thermals turn. Because you're right about one thing, one hit is a story, two is a fact. If she's carried, she comes apart on the second one. Nobody gets carried twice in the same hour with 100 people watching. Pruitt stared at him. Sir, with respect, that's not tighter. That's impossible. I know exactly what it is, Master Sergeant. Rhodes sat back. And so does she. And she'll say yes anyway. And you and I are both going to have to live with whatever happens next. Dismissed. She said yes without asking a single question. That was what Vasquez reported back, and it was the detail Rhodes kept returning to. Not that she agreed, he had expected her to agree. That she hadn't asked about the second plate, hadn't asked about the wind window, hadn't asked how much time she'd have, hadn't asked anything at all. Later he understood why. She had already assumed it would be two. In the world she came from, there had never once been a single opportunity that stayed single. The convoy left Blackfoot Ridge 2 hours before dawn. By the time it reached Coyote Flats, the range was crowded with more people than anybody had scheduled, and it was very obvious that word had traveled. Officers had invented reasons to be present. Senior NCOs had rearranged their week. Men who had never been to that facility in their lives had discovered an urgent professional interest in it. They all wanted to be able to say afterward that they'd been standing there. Rhodes arrived last and put a stop to the atmosphere in about 11 seconds. Let's get one thing understood before we start. This is not a show. This is an official evaluation conducted for a specific reason, and every one of you is going to conduct yourself accordingly, regardless of what you personally believe about the outcome. Am I clear? Yes, sir. But he could read it on their faces, the doubt, the half-hidden smiles, Pruitt near the front with his arms folded, wearing the expression of a man who had already decided how the morning would end and was simply waiting to be proven right about it. And then Adeline Rourke got out of the second vehicle and the whole line went quiet because she didn't look like anything. That was the first thing every single one of them registered, and several of them would be ashamed of it later. She looked small and young and completely unremarkable, a slight woman in ordinary gear carrying a case and a data book and nothing else. She didn't swagger. She didn't scan the crowd for faces. She didn't do the thing that shooters do when they arrive somewhere they intend to be watched. She walked to the firing position, set down the case, knelt beside it, and started working. That's her, somebody whispered. That's the 3200 girl. She looks like somebody's kid. She was somebody's kid. That was the thing not one man standing on that line was thinking about with their arms folded and their easy contempt. Somewhere in Bisbee, Arizona, there was a woman named Ruth Rourke who had spent 5 years asking her daughter exactly one question and receiving exactly one word back. Rhodes leaned toward Vasquez. Captain, you've watched a lot of shooters. Tell me what you're seeing. Vasquez didn't take his eyes off her. Sir, she isn't rushing. Every man out here is watching her, and she's moving like she's completely alone on this planet. That's the first thing, and it's the biggest thing. The really good ones perform. They speed up. They let the crowd get inside the rhythm. She's not performing for anybody, and I don't think she's aware anyone's here. He paused. And look at her hand, sir. It's 39 degrees. She's under more scrutiny than any shooter I have ever stood behind in 12 years, and there is no movement in her hands at all. That's not training, General. You cannot train that into somebody. That's what's left over after a person has done this when it actually mattered. When the target could shoot back, Rhodes said. Vasquez didn't answer, which was an answer. Down on the line, she settled in behind the Barrett. She pulled the data book. She checked the wind. She checked it again. She looked through the spotting scope at a plate sitting 3,200 meters out, across a broken ground invisible to the naked eye, exposed to crosswinds that turned and stacked between the ridges, out there in ways that had ruined better men than anyone present. Vasquez took his position as official observer. Sergeant Rourke, in your own time. There's no rush. This is your range. Yes, sir. She didn't say anything else. She had gone somewhere behind her own eyes, and Vasquez had watched shooters go there before, but never that fast and never that completely. Behind them, the muttering started. 10 minutes in, Pruitt said under his breath that she was stalling, that she was building the excuse before she took the shot, so she'd have somewhere to put the miss. Somebody said, give her a minute. A minute at that range, she needs a miracle, not a minute. Nobody hits steel at 3.2 clicks. Nobody. I don't care what her tab says. Not on a cold barrel, not on a cold morning, not in this wind, not on the first attempt. It cannot be done. And down on the line, Adeline Rourke breathed. She was not thinking about Pruitt. She was not thinking about the general or the crowd or the tab or the phone that had rung twice 2 nights ago and stopped. She was doing what she always did, the thing she had learned in a place she was not permitted to name, emptying herself out completely until there was nothing left inside her at all except wind and distance and the slow, patient arithmetic of persuading a piece of metal to travel 2 miles and arrive exactly where she needed it. She thought about a day she visited every single time she put her eye behind glass. She thought about a man who had been alive 4 seconds too early. And then she stopped thinking about anything. Her fingers settled. Vasquez, watching through the spotter, saw her body go completely still. Not the stillness of somebody holding tension, the stillness of somebody from whom every last ounce of tension had already drained out. Send it when you're ready, Sergeant, he said quietly. She didn't answer. She had stopped hearing him some time ago. She waited. She watched a ripple cross the flat and read it and let it go. Waited for the pocket of stillness she knew was coming in behind it. One breath in, one breath halfway out. The whole world narrowing to a single point of steel, 2 miles away, a point no eye on that line could see, a point that existed for her only as a number she was carrying in her hands. And behind her, 100 people held their breath in the same instant, believers and doubters, together, and not one of them could look away. She squeezed. The rifle came back into her shoulder, and the report rolled out across the flat and broke against the ridges. And then there was nothing. Nothing but wind and ringing ears and the unbearable weight of a piece of metal crossing 2 miles of cold morning air towards something nobody standing there could even see. 1 second. Pruitt smiled. 2 seconds. The smile widened. He said something to the man beside him about the miracle not showing up. 3 seconds. Vasquez did not breathe and did not blink because 12 years had taught him that the difference between confirming a shot and losing it lives inside 1 fraction of a second of inattention. 4 seconds. And then faint and impossibly far away, carried back across the entire length of that flat on thin desert air, came a single clean metallic sound. Steel. For 1 full heartbeat, nobody on that range moved. Then Vasquez lifted his head off the scope, and his face had gone completely white, and he said the only word he was capable of forming. Hit. Nobody responded, so he said it again, louder, loud enough to carry the whole length of the line, loud enough that it came back off the rocks. Confirmed hit, center mass, 3,200 meters cold, bore first round clean. The silence that followed was the loudest silence Malcolm Rhodes had ever stood inside of. Pruitt's smile was not gone. It had fallen off. What was underneath it was something Rhodes had never seen on the old master sergeant in 6 years. Something that looked a great deal like fear. His arms had come uncrossed. His mouth had come open slightly. He was staring down at a small young woman on the firing line, the way a man stares at something that has just rearranged the rules he built his life on top of. "That's not possible," Pruitt said. But there was no laughter in it this time. It came out as a whisper. "You just watched it happen, Master Sergeant," Vasquez said without turning around. "I'm looking at a fresh strike dead center right now, so you're going to need a different word. Impossible isn't going to work anymore." And then Rhodes said into all of that noise the thing that put the whole line back underwater. "Set the second plate." The wind turned at 0940, the way desert wind does all at once, like something changing its mind. Vasquez called it. Pruitt, who had said nothing at all for 30 minutes, walked down to the observer position without being asked and put his eye behind the second scope, and nobody questioned it, and Vasquez slid over to make room. Adeline Rourke had not moved from her position. She had not stood up. She had not celebrated the first one, and she had not looked back at the crowd once. She waited 11 minutes. 11 minutes is a very long time in front of 100 people. Long enough that men started shifting. Long enough that somebody near the back said low that she'd gotten lucky once and knew it and was sitting out there trying to find a way to not take the second shot. Pruitt heard it, and Wade Pruitt, who had signed a formal complaint about this woman 72 hours ago, turned his head and said, "Shut your mouth. She's reading a switch. If you can't see what she's reading, you don't get to talk." Down on the line, she was reading a switch. She was reading the flat pushing, left against a ridge, return coming right, and she was waiting for the moment they canceled each other out, and she knew from a place beneath thought that it would last somewhere between 4 and 9 seconds, and that if she was even slightly early, she would put a 50 caliber round into open desert in front of 100 witnesses and hand Emmett Drager something he could use. She had not known that thought was in her until it arrived. It had come with a phone call. She let it go. She let all of it go, the crowd, the general, the tab, the ring that stopped after 2, the man who had been alive 4 seconds too early, and she went back to that day the way she always did, and she stayed there and she breathed out halfway. She sent it. 4 seconds of nothing, and then steel again cleaner, this time ringing back across the flat like an answer. Pruitt came up off the scope so fast he nearly went over backward. "Confirmed," he said, and his voice cracked in the middle of the word. "Confirmed hit. Second plate, center, in the switch." He looked at Vasquez and then at nobody. "She shot it in the switch." And then Adeline Rourke did the thing that broke every man on that line a little without any of them understanding why. She didn't celebrate. She didn't come up off the rifle with her arms in the air. She didn't turn to find Pruitt's face and collect what she was owed. She pulled the bolt, ejected the casing, caught it, and set it carefully beside the first one. Then she opened her data book, picked up her pen, and began calmly, unhurriedly, in a small, disciplined hand to write down the results. Wind, temperature, density, altitude, hold, time of flight, switch duration. Every variable recorded exactly the way she would have recorded it if not one living soul had been watching. Exactly the way she had recorded 10,000 shots before this one, in places these men would never learn the names of. She was doing paperwork. She had just done a thing that maybe a dozen human beings on the planet could do twice in front of a crowd, assembled specifically to watch her fail, and her response to it was to do her paperwork. Something turned over in Rhodes's chest. He had spent 34 years learning to read soldiers, and he was reading one now, and what he read in the quiet and hurried way that young woman filled out her book was not talent. Talent he had seen. Talent showed off. Talent needed the room. This was a person for whom the extraordinary had become ordinary. A person who had been the best in the room so many times in so many places where being the best was the only thing keeping people alive that she had simply stopped noticing it. She was not impressed with herself. That was what hollowed him out. She had done the impossible twice before 10 in the morning, and she was not impressed because for Adeline Rourke, this had not been the impossible at all. This had been a Tuesday. Pruitt came down the line. Rhodes saw him coming and almost stopped it, and then something told him to let it happen. The old master sergeant stopped a few feet short of her and stood there, and for a long moment he couldn't get anything out at all. "Sergeant Rourke," she looked up. "Master Sergeant, I owe you an apology." The words came out of him like they cost something, and they did. "I said things in the club. I said somebody was carrying you. I filed a complaint on you that I signed in my name to. I said you'd missed by a mile." His throat worked. 28 years, and I have never seen a shot like either one of those. Not from anybody, not from the legends. And I judged you before I ever watched you put your eye behind glass, and I was wrong, and I'm man enough to stand here in front of everybody and say it. And here was the moment that changed something permanent in every person close enough to hear it. Adeline Rourke did not gloat. She did not say a single one of the 11 things she had every right to say. She stood up, and she looked at the old man almost gently. Master Sergeant, there's nothing to apologize for. You judged me by what you'd seen in 28 years, and in 28 years, nothing ever gave you a reason to believe a shot like that was possible. That's not cruelty, that's experience. She paused. The only difference between us is that I've been somewhere that taught me the impossible is just the part of the map nobody's walked far enough to reach yet. You're a good marksman. I can tell that from how you carry yourself and from the fact that you came down here and put your eye on that second plate instead of hiding from it. Don't ever apologize to me for being good at your job. Just be willing to see a little farther. She stopped, then added quieter. And Master Sergeant, whoever it is you've got out there grinding at a standard right now, tell him the map's bigger than the school says it is. Some people just need a longer run at it. Pruitt's face came apart. She had not been told about his son. Nobody had told her anything. She had simply looked at a man's cruelty and seen straight through to the wound underneath it, the way she saw wind, the way she saw distance. He came to attention, and a master sergeant with 28 years of service saluted a staff sergeant less than half his age and held it, and every person on that range understood they were watching something they would carry for the rest of their lives. Yes, ma'am, he said, I will. She returned it, and then because she was who she was, she knelt back down and went back to her data book. The drive back down was nothing like the drive out. Going out, the convoy had been loud with confident men trading predictions. Coming back, it was quiet, the specific quiet of people whose certainties had come apart in 2 ringing seconds of steel, and who were still trying to fit the pieces back into a shape they recognized. Somewhere in the middle of that convoy, a young sergeant finally said the thing all of them were chewing on. Where do you even learn that that's not marksmanship school? I went to sniper school. They don't teach that. Nobody teaches that. And Pruitt, staring out at the road, answered him, You don't learn that in a school, son. You learn that in a place where missing gets somebody killed, where the target isn't steel, where it's a threat standing over people you're responsible for, and you get 1 round, and there is no second one, and if your hand moves, somebody's kids grow up without a father. He shook his head slowly. That girl's been somewhere none of us have been. And she came back, and she's been carrying it around by herself ever since, and not one of us bothered to ask. We just decided she was a fraud because it was easier on us. Nobody in that vehicle said another word the rest of the way down. Word beat the convoy to the gate. By the time the vehicles rolled through, the story had already crossed the whole depot and grown in the telling the way all real stories do. Some said 3 shots. Some said she'd called the second one before she took it. Some said the general had wept. None of it was true, and none of it mattered because the center of it was true, and the center was enough. But there was one person on Blackfoot Ridge who heard it and did not repeat it. I was 61 years old, and he worked the arms room window, and he had been on that depot for 2 years, signing weapons in and out for people who barely looked at him, because that is what a retired chief warrant officer does when he cannot make himself leave the Army entirely. He had heard the number that morning like everybody else, and it had done nothing to him. Then the vehicles came in, and the door of the second one opened, and he saw her face in full daylight for the first time, and not through a window, not bent over a signature card, not from the side. Her face, the clipboard hit the floor. He didn't pick it up. He stood there with his hands empty and his mouth open, and something happening behind his eyes that had nothing to do with a rifle or a range or a number. He had been looking for that face for 5 years. He had filed requests. He had written letters that came back stamped. He had stood at 3 funerals and said out loud to men who understood that he was going to find the person who saved him or die trying. And he had signed a Barrett out to her 14 mornings in a row without ever once looking up. The 70 hours between that phone call and Emmett Drager's return were the longest of Adeline Rourke's life, and she spent almost none of them asleep. It was not fear that kept her up. She had made her peace with fear a long time ago, in places where fear was a luxury nobody could afford to carry. It was the other thing, the one she did not have a name for because she had never been permitted to have it. Hope was heavier than fear. Fear she knew how to hold. Fear had a shape and a weight and a place to set it down. Hope sat on her chest all night, and every time she started to let herself believe it, an old voice that sounded a great deal like a man in a gray suit whispered that it would be taken back, that it always was that people like her did not get to keep things like this. At 3 in the morning, she gave up entirely and walked over to Bay 3 because cleaning a rifle was still what her hands did when the rest of her could not be still. She was not surprised to find she wasn't alone. You couldn't sleep either, sir. I haven't slept the night before a fight in 34 years, Sergeant. I don't intend to start now. Rhodes gestured at the bench beside him. Sit down. You're making me tired standing there like you're waiting on orders. She sat. For a while, neither of them said anything. I want to tell you what's going to happen in that room, he said finally. Not the plan. You know the plan. Landry's 3 friends land at '06. Mott has the packet ready. My phone calls have gone where they needed to go. Drager walks in at 0900 and finds a room he didn't budget for. He paused. I mean, I want to tell you what's going to happen to you in that room. Because I've been in rooms like it, and I know what they do to a person. Sir, I mean that in 6 hours for the first time in 5 years, you're going to have to say the whole thing out loud in front of the man who taught you to keep it buried, and your body is going to fight you the entire way. Every reflex he built into you is going to come up at once and tell you to be quiet, to protect them, to make yourself small, and it is going to feel like your own good instincts, because that's the trick. That's the whole trick. He didn't install a fear. He installed a virtue and pointed it at himself. She didn't answer that. I've watched brave people freeze in that moment, Rourke. Not cowards. Brave ones, the bravest men I ever commanded, have locked up when the thing coming at them wasn't a bullet but a truth. So I want you to know before it happens that if you freeze, if your voice quits on you, if you can't get the words up out of your chest, it doesn't mean you're weak. It means the cage was very, very well built. And I'll be standing right there. So will Mott. So will 4 men who owe you everything. You are not going to have to carry that room by yourself. She looked at her hands. I've never said it out loud, General. Not all of it start to finish. I gave you and the Colonel pieces this week, and it nearly took the top of my head off. Her voice dropped. I don't know if I can. You don't have to know. You just have to show up. That's all anybody's ever had to do, show up and let the people who love you carry the parts you can't. He picked up his coffee, found it cold, and drank it anyway. You've spent your whole life being the one who carries it for everybody else. Tomorrow you're going to let us carry something for you. Consider it an order, if that makes it easier. And in the dark of Bay 3, Adeline Rourke almost laughed. You're a strange kind of general, sir. So I've been told, repeatedly, by men who outranked me and lived to regret it. He stood. Go try to sleep, Sergeant. You're going to need it. She didn't sleep, but for the first time she thought she might survive the morning. They came in on the red-eye, and they came in one at a time, and each of them stopped in the doorway when they saw her, and each of them had the same expression. The face of a man receiving an answer he had waited half a decade for and no longer expected to get. Theo Nakamura came first. 47 retired Master Sergeant, hands too big for the rest of him. He crossed the room and studied her face like he was trying to memorize it against some future, in which it might be taken away again. And then he said, I have a son. He's 8. His voice was already going. His name is Micah. Ma'am, I named my boy after the man who didn't come out of that pickup zone, and every single time I call that kid in for dinner, I'm saying the name of a man who died 4 seconds before you could get to him. I've done that 8 years, and nobody ever told me there was somebody out there carrying those same 4 seconds. He stopped, breathed, went on. You gave me every bedtime story, every scraped knee, every parent-teacher conference. You gave me my son, and I didn't know your face. Dom Rose came second and could not say anything at all. He tried twice. Nothing came. Finally, he just took her hand and pressed it between both of his and put his head down. And the shaking of his shoulders said everything his voice would not. And nobody in that room tried to fill the silence for him because some men have already said it all and are simply unable to get it into the air. Colby Ray came last, the youngest, 38 now, and looking older. We used to talk about you, he said, the 4 of us. At reunions late after everybody else went to bed, we called you the ghost, the shot that came out of nowhere and saved us and then vanished. His eyes were red. We used to raise a glass to the ghost every year. To your memory, ma'am, we've been drinking to you like you were dead while you were out there alone carrying this, and I don't know how to apologize for that. We should have torn the world apart looking for you. Instead, we let a man in a suit decide we never would. And standing in the middle of these four men, something in Adeline Rourke that had been sealed shut since she was 19 years old began very slowly to come apart in the best possible way. I didn't know, she said, and her voice was in pieces. I didn't know any of you wanted to find me. He told me you'd want me hidden. He told me if I ever came forward, it would destroy you. And I believed him because I couldn't imagine anybody wanting to find the person who did what I did. I thought if you ever learned it was me, you'd look at me and see the thing that killed a man in front of you. I didn't think you'd see the person who saved you. I thought you'd see the weapon. Belandri took her by both shoulders. Listen to me. Listen to me right now before that man walks through that door. His grip tightened. When you made that shot, I did not see a weapon. I saw the hand of God come down into the worst minute of my life and pull me out of it. There is not one man standing in this room who has ever for 1 second thought of you as anything but the reason we're breathing. He told you we'd see a monster. He lied. We see a hero. We have always seen a hero. And the only tragedy in 5 years is that we couldn't get within 1,000 miles of you to say so. He pulled her in and the other three closed around them. And for a while there were no ranks in that room at all. Rhodes watched from the doorway with Mott beside him, and neither of them said a word because some things you do not interrupt. At 0852, the black SUV came through the gate. He's here, Mott said, and Rhodes watched the room change. He watched her step back out of the middle of those four men and straighten. He watched the four of them, without one word passing between them, arrange themselves around her, not in front of her, not shielding her, but beside her, spaced out along the line, so that when the door opened, Dreger would see her standing among them as an equal, as one of their own. Landry took the position on her right. Rhodes noticed that. So did she. Dreger came in with his case and his gray suit and the confidence of a man who had already decided how the morning would end. He had broken people considerably more powerful than a depot commander before breakfast. He had made colonels weep and had not thought about it afterward. He had once taken a 19-year-old girl and built a cage around her so perfect that she had lived inside it for 5 years and thanked him for it. He walked in. He opened his mouth. And then he saw them. And for the first time since he had set foot on Blackfoot Ridge, Emmett Dreger stopped smiling. What is this? This, Rhodes said, is the truth standing in a room. All of it in one place at one time, which I understand is the one thing you spent 5 years making certain would never happen. Dreger's eyes went down the line. Rhodes watched the recognition arrive one face at a time and watched the confidence go out of him in exactly the same order. You brought them here. The silk had gone thin. That was a mistake, General, a serious one. You have no idea what you've just set in motion. Then enlighten me. Tell me in front of these four witnesses and this colonel exactly what terrible thing happens now that the woman you buried and the men you told her she was protecting are standing in the same room. Rhodes spread his hands. Go ahead, Mr. Dreger. Explain your arrangement out loud to the people it was built to deceive. I'd genuinely like to hear it. Dreger recovered the way men like him always do. He set the case down, straightened his jacket, and came back at half volume, which was worse. You're all being very emotional. I understand. Reunions are moving. He turned. But sentiment doesn't move facts, and the facts haven't changed. The events of that day touch on matters that certain very important people would prefer remain private. That's still true this morning. And if it comes into the light, gentlemen, it will not be me who suffers. It'll be you four. It'll be your pensions and your families and your names in a hearing transcript. And it will be her for dragging you into it. And then he turned to her, and his voice dropped into that low, reasonable register that had run her life for 5 years. You understand that, Addie. You've always understood it. That's why you stayed silent. Not because I made you, because you knew, because deep down you know that some truths destroy more than they save. And you have never once in your life been willing to spend other people to buy yourself something. He let that sit. Don't let these good men in the heat of a beautiful morning talk you into burning down more than you can rebuild. That isn't who you are. You know it isn't. And there it was. The exact moment Rhodes had warned her about at 3 in the morning. Because he had not threatened her. He had not raised his voice or produced a document or made a single move. He had simply picked up that best thing in her and turned it around and handed it back to her sharp end first. And Adeline Rourke froze. Rhodes saw it happen. He saw the old training take hold of her body, saw her shoulders come in half an inch, saw the words catch somewhere below her throat exactly the way he had told her they would, and he saw her fight it and lose the first round of it, and Draeger saw it too. Rhodes watched the man's chin lift a quarter inch as he felt the room start to come back to him, and Rhodes did not step in. It cost him something not to. Every instinct he had was screaming to put himself between her and that voice the way he had put himself between her and the man 3 days ago. But he understood standing there that this one was hers, that if anybody wanted for her, it would not stay one, and she would be back inside that cage, the first quiet night she spent alone with it. So he did the only thing left. He looked at her. And so did Mott, and so did 4 men who owed her their lives, and not one of them said a word, and Bolandry, standing on her right, did the one thing anybody did. He shifted his weight so that his arm came against hers. That was all. All. Contact. The physical fact of another human being standing in the same place at the same time. She unfroze. I understood it when I was 19, Mr. Draeger. Her voice came out quiet, and it did not shake. I understood it because I was 19 years old and I had just watched what a 50 caliber round does to a human being. And 40 minutes before that, I watched a man named Micah Dell die 4 seconds ahead of my shot, and I was drowning. And you were the only calm thing in the room. You spoke slowly. You sounded so certain. And I grabbed onto every word you said because there was nothing else in that room to grab. She took one step forward. And you knew that. You came to me in the worst hour of my life when I was too broken to think, and you built a cage while I was still too grateful to be alive to notice the bars going up. Addie, but I'm not 19 anymore. Her voice was getting stronger with every sentence the way a thing gets easier the second time you lift it. And I've spent this week finding out that almost everything you ever told me was a lie. You told me my silence protected these 4 men. It never protected them. It protected you. You told me the truth would destroy them. She turned her head. Look at them. Look at their faces. Do those men look destroyed to you? They look like they've been let out. The only person in this room the truth destroys is you, and that's the only reason it was ever a secret. She took another step. You told me I was a weapon, a capability, something to be stored on a shelf and taken down when it was needed. And I believed that too for 5 years. Because when somebody tells you that in the moment you're most afraid, it goes in deep and it stays. But I'm not a weapon, Mr. Draeger. I made a shot at 19 that brought 4 men home, and I have never once been ashamed of it. What I've been ashamed of is you, and I'm done carrying your shame around inside my chest and calling it mine. The room did not make a sound. Draeger's jaw worked once. It's a lovely speech, he said, and it changes nothing because you cannot prove a single word of it. There's no order. There's no memorandum. There's no recording. There's a woman with a sealed file and a story about a conversation 5 years ago that nobody witnessed. He picked up his case. That's all you have. That's all you were ever going to have. And I want you to understand I'm not angry with you. You've had a difficult week, and people said kind things to you, and it went to your head. That's human. He smiled again thinly. But we both know how this ends, Addie. It ends the way it always ends. You'll come to your senses in about 6 hours, and you'll be very glad I didn't hold this against you. You're right about one thing, she said. Am I? There was no witness. She reached into her cargo pocket. There was only me, and she put a data book down on the table between them. It was old. The corners had gone soft and round the way canvas goes when it has lived in a pocket for years. The elastic band across it had been replaced at least twice. Draeger looked at it, and for exactly 1 second, nothing happened on his face at all, which was itself the loudest thing that had happened in that room. That's a range book, he said. It's the range book. Sergeant, Rhodes said quietly, what is that? It's mine, sir, from that deployment. She kept her eyes on Draeger. You want to know the thing nobody ever understands about me? Everybody thinks the number came from a gift. It didn't. It came from doing one ordinary thing perfectly 10,000 times when there was nobody in the room and no reward for doing it right. Her hand rested flat on the cover. I log every shot I take, Conditions hold time of flight result. Every shot my whole life. And I logged that one too. You logged, Mott said. 40 minutes after it happened, Colonel, I was sitting on the floor with my hands shaking so hard I could barely hold the pen, and I wrote it down because that's what my hands do when the rest of me can't be still. She finally looked away from Drager at Mott. You've all seen me do it. Every man on that firing line watched me do it Tuesday and thought it was strange. That's the whole story of my life, sir. I do my paperwork. She opened the book. Wind, temperature, density, altitude, range, time of flight 6.1 seconds. Result. Her finger moved down. And then because I was 19 and I didn't know what any of it meant, and I thought somebody would want to know. Eventually, I wrote down everything else I'd seen through that glass in the 40 minutes before. Movement, positions, 5 friendlies, and a 6th man on the ground in civilian clothes who wasn't with anybody's element. She turned the book around. I didn't have a name for him that day. I got one that night. Drager did not move. You sat down next to me, she said. You were the only calm thing in the room. And you needed me to trust you, so you told me your name. You gave it to a shaking teenager because you were absolutely certain that within a week that teenager would cease to exist. Her voice went very flat. I wrote it down, Mr. Drager. I wrote it down 2 hours after you said it, and I stitched that page into the lining of the back cover the same night, and I have carried it in my pocket through 4 duty stations in 5 years, and every single time you called. Nobody in that room breathed. You built everything on one assumption, Mott said. He had come up off the wall. That there was no record. That's the entire architecture. Split the truth into pieces, hand each piece to a different frightened person. Make sure no 2 pieces ever meet in the same room. He looked at the book. And the piece you never accounted for is that the 19-year-old you were burying had a habit. A habit, Drager said. She writes things down, Rhodes said. That's it. That's the whole thing. You spent 5 years terrified of a shot that maybe a dozen people on Earth could make, and what actually ends you is a pencil. He turned. Colonel, is that page consistent with what you handed to my contacts on Thursday? It's better than consistent, sir. Mott's voice had steadied all the way out. It's contemporaneous. It's dated. It's in a maintained log with 5 years of unbroken entries on either side of it. There isn't a board in this country that would look at that and see a story about a conversation. And it names him, Rhodes said. It names him, sir. Drager stood very still and Rhodes watched him do the last thing men like him ever do. Go around the room one more time looking for the crack. For the one frightened person he could talk to. He looked at Mott, who had been the easiest man in the world to move 5 years ago, and Mott looked straight back at him. He looked at Landry, and Landry did not blink. He looked at Rhodes, who smiled at him without any warmth at all. And then he looked at her one last time, searching for the thing he had been running on for 5 years. The fear, it wasn't there. Where there had once been a drowning 19-year-old holding on to the only steady voice in a room full of noise. There was a woman standing straight with 4 men beside her, and there was nothing in her face that Emmett Drager could use because he had built his entire power on her terror, and her terror was gone. He had lost her, and he had lost her some time ago, and this was only the moment he found out. Here's what happens now, Rhodes said. You're going to pick up your case. You're going to walk out. You're going to drive off my mountain, and you are never going to come near this soldier again because there is nothing left for you to hold over her. The leash is cut, and a man like you has no power at all. Once the leash is cut, you only ever had the fear, and she isn't afraid of you anymore. Drager picked up his case. He straightened his jacket one final time, a small, pointless gesture from a man who had run out of moves, and he did not say anything because there was nothing left to say that would work on anyone in that room. He walked out, and they listened to the vehicle start and pull away and go down off the mountain, and every person standing there knew with complete certainty that he was not coming back because a man like Emmett Drager is only as powerful as the frightened people around him, and the one person who had been frightened of him for 5 years had just stopped in front of witnesses permanently. The silence he left behind was not heavy this time. For the first time in 5 years, it was light. It was the specific lightness of a weight that has finally been set down. Adeline Rourke let out a breath she seemed to have been holding since she was 19 and put both hands on the table and stood there. And then Bo Landry, without anybody telling him to, came to attention. Nakamura came to attention beside him. Then Ruiz. Then Ray. Four men straight and tall in a row, and they raised their hands and saluted a staff sergeant less than half the age of two of them. And they held it. On behalf of four men who came home, Landry said, and he did not bother with the tears at all. And every single person in walking around on this earth because we did. Every wife, every kid, every grandkid. Thank you, Sergeant Rourke. He held the salute. We found you. 5 years and we found you. And I swear to you on everything I've got, nobody is ever making you disappear again. She brought her hand up. It took her 3 tries to get it steady enough to hold at her brow, and she did not manage to keep it steady after that. And she was weeping openly in front of 6 men and did not care about a single tear of it, because for the first time in 5 years, she was not crying from the weight. She was crying from the absence of it. There was no headline. That was the first thing Adeline Rourke had to learn to live with, and it turned out to be harder than she expected. Some part of her had braced for an explosion camera's hearings, her face somewhere she couldn't take it back from. She had spent 5 years terrified of being seen and had somehow arrived at a morning where the not being seen felt like a door closing again. It wasn't. It was just the way these things actually go. The reckoning for what had happened 5 years ago was handled quietly by exactly the sort of people whose entire professional lives consist of handling things quietly. Mott's packet went where Rhodes's phone calls had already prepared the ground for it, and then a second packet went somewhere else, and then a woman with a federal badge and no interest whatsoever in small talk spent 11 hours across a table from Adeline in a room at Blackfoot Ridge with the data book sitting between them in an evidence sleeve. She gave the book up. That was the hardest hour of the whole thing, and nobody who wasn't in that room ever understood why. She had carried that page in her pocket through 4 duty stations. It had been the only object on earth that knew what she knew. Handing it across a table felt physically like handing over a piece of her own body, and her hands did not want to let go of it, and for about 90 seconds she genuinely could not make them. Landry was standing against the wall behind her because Rhodes had insisted somebody be in the room who wasn't a lawyer. "Ma'am," he said, "you've been holding that thing up by yourself for 5 years. Let somebody else take a turn." She let go. The woman with the badge read the stitched-in page twice, closed the sleeve, and said one sentence before she left, which was the only sentence she said all day that wasn't a question. "Sergeant, in 19 years, I have never seen a 19-year-old do a smarter thing under that much stress. Whoever taught you to write it down, thank them for me." "Nobody taught me, ma'am," Adeline said. "I just didn't want to forget the wind." Emmett Drager was never seen at Blackfoot Ridge again. What happened to him afterward was not the kind of thing that gets announced. Rhodes was told months later in a phone call that lasted 40 seconds and contained no proper nouns at all that the arrangement had come apart at every seam, and that several people considerably more senior than Drager had come apart with it, and that if the general wanted a name, he was not going to get one, and that he should consider the matter closed. He considered it closed. He also considered privately that a man who had spent his career terrifying people into silence had ended up disappearing into a silence of somebody else's making, and that there was a kind of arithmetic in that he did not feel obligated to feel bad about. He never told Adeline the details. She never asked. That surprised him until he thought about it. She had never wanted him ruined. She had only ever wanted him to stop being able to reach her. Her file was unsealed. Not all of it. Some of it would stay black forever, and both she and Rhodes understood that and made their peace with it. But the parts that had been sealed, for no lawful reason at all, the parts that had only ever been black because one man needed them. Black came open, and for the first time since she was 19 years old, the officers responsible for Staff Sergeant Adeline Rourke were permitted to know who they were responsible for. Rhodes read the unsealed portion alone in his office on a Tuesday evening with the door shut. It took him 2 hours, and he did not get up once, and when he was finished, he sat back and put a hand over his eyes and stayed like that for a while. Because it wasn't just the one day. He had assumed everybody had assumed that the tab and the number and the black file were all one event. One impossible morning at 19 and 5 years of silence afterward. It was not one event. There were 3 more entries in that file that Malcolm Rhodes was clear to read, and every one of them was a day that most soldiers would build an entire career on top of, and she had never mentioned a single one of them, not to Mott, not to Vasquez in that barracks room, not to him on a bench at 3 in the morning when he had all but begged her to let somebody carry something. She had told them about the day that hurt. She had never once told anybody about the days she was proud of. He put the folder in his safe and sat there and understood finally and completely what Draeger had actually stolen. Not 5 years. The habit of being known. He had taken a 19-year-old and taught her that the safest possible version of herself was the smallest one, and she had gotten so good at it that she had gone on doing it long after the man was out of the room. That Rhodes decided was the part he was going to spend the rest of his time in uniform undoing. The four of them did not go away. She had expected them to. She had braced for it the way she braced for everything one good weekend. A lot of feeling, some phone numbers exchanged, and then the slow, polite fade that happens when people's lives resume. She had told herself it was fine. She had told herself she'd gotten more than she ever expected, and it would be greedy to want it to keep going. They did not fade. Nakamura called every Sunday, every single Sunday at 1900 her time without exception and without ever making a big deal about it. And about a month in, he stopped asking how she was and started just telling her about his week, which she eventually realized was the greater kindness of the two. Ray sent things, absurd things, a coffee mug, a cheap desert-themed keychain, a photograph of his kid's science project. She could not figure out what he was doing until Landry explained it to her one afternoon. The man was proving she had an address, that there was a place in the world where mail arrived for Adeline Rourke and somebody had to sign for it. Ruiz never called. Ruiz wrote letters in handwriting that took her 20 minutes a page to decode, and the letters said things his voice had never managed. In the third one, he told her that he had not slept a full night in 5 years, and that he had slept 8 hours the night after he flew home from Nevada, and that he had cried in the airport parking lot for 40 minutes and had not been embarrassed about it once. And Landry was simply there every morning at the arms room window. That was the part that undid her most because it was the smallest. He still ran that window. He did not transfer. He did not retire again. He did not turn the reunion into anything. He just stopped saying ma'am and started saying her name, and every morning when she came to sign for a weapon, he looked up. That was all. He looked up. She counted it the first week. She could not help it. 14 mornings he had not looked up, and now every single morning he did. And by the end of the first month, she stopped counting, and by the end of the second, she had stopped noticing, and that, not the salute, not the hearing, not the unsealed file, was the moment Adeline Rourke actually came back from wherever she had been. In late spring, Nakamura brought his son. He had asked her permission twice, and she had said yes both times, and then spent 2 weeks not sleeping about it, because there was one specific thing she did not know how she was going to survive. The boy's name was Micah. He was 8. He had his father's ears and none of his father's caution, and he came across that visitor's lot at a dead sprint, because 8-year-olds do not walk anywhere. "Are you the one who saved my dad?" Nakamura started to say something, and she put a hand up. "Yes," she said, "I am. Dad says you did it from really far." "Pretty far." "How far?" 2 miles. The kid's whole face rearranged itself. "That's insane." "It was a good day for it," she said. And then he stuck out his hand to shake very formally, because somebody had taught him that, and she took it, and it was a small hand, and it was warm, and it was completely unremarkably alive. She held it a half-second too long. She got through the rest of the visit. She got through lunch and the tour and the picture the kid insisted on. She waited until the car pulled out of the lot and turned onto the access road, and then she walked into Bay 3 and sat down on the floor with her back against the rack and put both hands over her face. That was where Landry found her 20 minutes later. He didn't say anything. He got down on the floor beside her, which at 61 took him some doing, and he sat there. "His name is Micah," she said finally. "I know." He said it out loud, Chief. He said his own name to me and shook my hand. Her voice cracked all the way through. "I've been carrying 4 seconds for 5 years. 4 seconds. And that kid is walking around with his name." "Yeah. How is that fair? How is any of that fair? Micah Dell doesn't get anything. He doesn't get a name in a file. He doesn't get 8-year-old hands. He got 4 seconds on the wrong side of my shot, and that's it. That's the whole thing. And I've spent 5 years going back into that day, and it never once comes out different." "Addie," she stopped. "I was there," Landry said. You know what I was doing during those 4 seconds? I was lying on my face 200 meters from Mike Adele, and I could not have gotten to him if you'd given me an hour. Nobody could. Not you, not me, not the President of the United States. He let that sit. Those 4 seconds weren't yours to win. They were already spent before you ever got glass on them. What you did have was the 11 seconds after, and you used every one of them. And there's a kid in a Toyota headed for the airport right now with that man's name on him because of it. She didn't answer. You want to carry Mike Adele, carry him. I do. All four of us do. That's ours, and we're not putting it down. His voice roughened. But you don't get to carry him as a failure because that's a lie. And I've watched you swallow enough lies for one lifetime. She sat there on the floor of the bay where a general had once thrown her into a steel rack, and she cried. And Beau Landry sat beside her and did not try to fix any of it. And eventually she stopped, and eventually she stood up, and eventually she went back to work. She would carry Mike Adele for the rest of her life, but she never again carried him the same way. Also, in July, she drove to Bisbee. It was 14 hours, and she did it in one push, and she spent most of it rehearsing a conversation she had rehearsed 100 times in 5 years and had never once been able to have. Ruth Rourke came out onto the porch before the truck was even off. She was 63 years old, and she had spent 5 years being told nothing at all by a daughter she had raised alone, and she had never once complained about it, and that had somehow made it worse. They sat at the kitchen table. Adeline could not tell her the details. Some of it would stay black forever, and she had signed things saying so, and she meant to honor them, and she had come all this way knowing that she was going to have to sit across from her own mother and still not be able to say the whole thing. But she had come to say what she could. Mom, I can't tell you where I was. I'm never going to be able to tell you. She had to stop. But I need you to know that all those years when I couldn't say anything and you thought maybe I just didn't want to, that wasn't it. Not one day of it was that. Ruth Rourke looked at her for a long moment. Honey, she said, I've got exactly one question. It's the same one I've been asking for 5 years. And I'd like a real answer this time if you've got one. Adeline's throat closed. Are you safe? And for the first time since she was 19 years old, Adeline Rourke was able to answer that question without the truth being more complicated than the word. Yes, Mom. Her voice broke on it. I'm safe, and I'm not carrying it by myself anymore. Her mother reached across the table and took her hand and did not ask for one single thing more. That was the part Adeline had not prepared for. She had prepared 4 questions. She had prepared for hurt, for why didn't you tell me for 5 years of held-back grievance coming out over a kitchen table. Instead, her mother just held her hand and after a while said, okay, and got up and started making dinner and asked her whether she still hated bell peppers. And Adeline Rourke, who had faced down a lieutenant general and a man in a gray suit without her hands moving, put her head down on her mother's kitchen table and sobbed like a child. Rhodes started telling a story. He never used her name. He would never use her name, and everybody who heard the story understood that the not using of it was part of the point. He told it to new lieutenants. He told it to sergeants coming up. He told it in a mess hall in October to a room of people who had expected a speech about readiness and got something else entirely. The finest soldier I ever commanded, he would say, was somebody I grabbed by the shoulder and threw into a weapons rack on her first morning on my installation. Because she was young, because she was quiet, because she didn't announce herself and she didn't look like what I'd already decided greatness was supposed to look like. He would let that sit until it got uncomfortable. I decided who she was before I did her the basic courtesy of finding out. That's the worst thing a commander can do, and I did it in under 9 seconds. And then he'd give them the only piece of wisdom he claimed was worth anything after 34 years. Greatness does not announce itself. Sometimes it's standing in an armory, doing a job nobody's watching, carrying a weight nobody in the room could imagine, and it will stand there for years if you let it. The difference between a good leader and a worthless one is not whether you can spot the loud ones. Any fool can spot the loud ones. It's whether you'll take 30 seconds to look closer at the quiet one. Somebody always asked what happened to her, and Rhodes always said the same thing. She's still doing the job. That's the whole point of her. She turned down 3 offers. The first came in August and would have moved her to a schoolhouse on the other side of the country in an instructor billet that most people in her line of work would have committed minor crimes for. The second came in September and was better. The third came in November from somewhere she was not permitted to discuss, and it was the kind of offer that does not usually get made twice. She said no to all three. Rhodes asked her about it directly because he had promised her once that he would always tell her the truth, and he had come to expect the same back. Sergeant, that third one was extraordinary. And you didn't take 24 hours on it. No, sir. Talk to me, because from where I sit, that looked like a woman running from something, and I've got a professional obligation to ask. She thought about it for a moment, which he had learned meant she was going to give him a real answer. General, for 5 years, everything about my life was decided by somebody else. Where I went, what name my file had on it, whether I got to be a person that week. She shrugged slightly. So the first time in 5 years that a genuinely good thing gets offered to me, and I get to actually choose, I want to choose to stay. Not because I'm scared of the other thing, because staying is mine. I've never gotten to have a mine before. Rhodes nodded slowly. All right. And there's a second reason, sir, and it's bigger, and I'd like to ask the general for something. Ask. I want to run a range program out at Coyote Flats. Fundamentals. Long-range basics open to anybody on this depot who wants to come, regardless of MOS or how far they got in a school. She was talking faster now, which he had never heard her do. Not to find the next me. There isn't a next me, and I wouldn't wish it on anyone. To find the ones who are grinding at a standard and coming up short and being told they're not built for it. Because half of them aren't unbuilt, sir. They just never had anybody sit behind them and tell them the truth about wind. Rhodes looked at her for a long moment. Approved. Sir, I haven't given you the budget. Sergeant, I have been waiting 6 months for you to ask me for something, anything. He almost smiled. You've been handed a hearing, an unsealed file, and 3 career-making offers. And this is the first time you've come into my office and asked me for a thing you wanted. Approved. Bring me the budget Thursday and I'll sign it Thursday. The first person to sign up was Wade Pruitt. He came in person on the first morning at 05:30 before anybody else, and he was not alone. He had his son with him. The kid was 22 and looked like he'd rather be anywhere on earth, standing there with the specific hunched misery of a young man who had failed at the one thing he'd told everybody he was going to do and had now been dragged out to the desert by his father. Pruitt didn't make a speech about it. Sergeant Rourke, this is my boy. He washed out of the course in March. He said it flat in front of the kid, which was its own kind of respect. I told him for 2 months that the standard is the standard and nobody gets carried, which is true. His jaw worked. I also told him that if you can't make it, you weren't built for it. And that part I got from 28 years of never once having seen anything change my mind. And then I watched you shoot in a switch. He turned to his son. Tell her what you told me in the truck. The kid's ears went red. I don't tell her. I said, I don't see how she does it, the kid muttered. Nobody does, Adeline said. That's the first useful thing you've said all morning. Get your gear. The boy blinked. Ma'am, you said you don't see how. Good, that's the actual problem, and you just named it in 8 words, which is faster than most people manage. She was already walking. You can't see when, nobody can, so we stop trying to see it and we start reading what it does to things that are visible. That's the whole craft. Everything else is arithmetic, and you can be taught arithmetic by anybody. Ma'am, I already washed out. She stopped and turned around. Do you know what the difference is between you and me? No, ma'am. Somebody sat down behind me when I was your age and refused to let me believe I was finished. That's it. That's the entire difference. And I've had 5 years to look for another one, and there isn't one. She let that land. Gear, now. The wind's better at 06, and I'm not wasting it on your feelings. Wade Pruitt turned away and did not turn back around for about a minute, and nobody said anything about it. By the following spring, the Coyote Flats program had a waiting list. By that summer, 2 people had come out of it and gone back to a school they had previously failed, and both had passed, and one of them was Pruitt's son. Pruitt himself never missed a session. 52 years old, 29 years in spotting for a woman half his age. And when a young sergeant asked him once why he bothered, he said, because I filed a complaint against her once, and she thanked me for it. You ever have somebody do that to you, you'll understand. And then on an ordinary Tuesday morning in the fall in Bay 3, Adeline Rourke saw a private. She almost didn't. That was the thing she thought about afterward. and it kept her up that night in a way she was glad of. She almost walked right past. The kid was 19, maybe 18, small and quiet, and working in the corner, where the light was bad, cleaning a weapon that had already been cleaned once that morning by somebody else. She was doing it slowly and carefully and completely alone, and she had positioned herself in the one spot in that entire bay where nobody walking through would have any reason to look. Adeline knew that spot. She had spent 5 years finding that spot in every building she'd ever been assigned to. She had her data book in her hand and arranged to open in 40 minutes and 11 people waiting on her out at Coyote Flats. She stopped. She stood there for a second and something went through her that she would not have been able to explain to anybody who hadn't lived it. The memory of 14 mornings of walking past a window without being seen, and 5 years before that of being nobody on purpose, and one single morning when a man had finally looked at a number on her chest and asked what it meant. One question, that was all it had ever taken. 5 years of a life given back by one man being curious enough to ask. Nobody had asked her in 5 years. She set the data book down on the bench. She walked over and got down on her heels beside a private first class who flinched slightly when she realized somebody was there, and who then went rigid because a staff sergeant everybody on this depot told stories about was suddenly 3 feet away and looking at her. "Ma'am, you've cleaned that receiver twice." The kid's face went red. Sorry, ma'am, I'm not correcting you. I did the same thing for 5 years. Adeline sat down on the floor, which put her lower than the private, which she did on purpose. "I'm going to ask you something, and I want a real answer, not the answer you think I want. Nobody's grading it, and it doesn't go anywhere." The girl swallowed. "Yes, ma'am." And Adeline Rourke asked her the question, "What are you carrying?" The private opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Her chin went once, and she got it back under control, and she looked at the floor, and it took her a long time. And Adeline waited. She had all the time in the world. She had 11 people at a range and a schedule and a truck running outside, and she was not going anywhere at all because she knew exactly what was happening inside that 19-year-old right now. The reflex fighting the want. The certainty that saying it out loud would cost something, the 5-year habit of being small, arriving all at once, and telling her to say nothing, "Ma'am, I'm fine." She waited. "It's kind of a long thing, ma'am," the private said finally. "Good," said Adeline Rourke. "I've got nothing but time." Nobody had asked her for 5 years, and it had taken exactly one question to give her whole life back. So she asked that morning and every morning after it for the rest of her career, of every quiet kid in every bad corner of every building she ever worked in. Because the most extraordinary person in any room is almost always the one nobody is looking at. And she will stand there in the dark forever, doing her job, carrying something impossible, waiting for one single person to care enough to look closer. Adeline Rourke had been that person once. She made damn sure she was never the last one.